In many ways, George H.W. Bush's administration was a caretaker administration. And all I mean by that is that he was seen as carrying through the Reagan legacy. He was seen as continuing. He would be the person to continue the Reagan legacy when he won election in 1988. And we could spend a lot more time talking about that election and how things went down, but we won't. I do want to say, however, that one of the defining factors or elements of the George H.W. Bush's administration had to be the war in Iraq. Remember that you've had these events occurring, especially in Europe, that would suggest that the Soviet Union, which was already showing sort of cracks, was now beginning to weaken and perhaps even split up, losing control or direct control over its satellite states. Into that mix, and going back to the Middle East, we can throw Iraq. August the 2nd, 1990, Iraqi military troops invaded the small country of Kuwait, which exists just at the tip end of the tip end of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates come together into the Persian Gulf. And you got to remember that all of these nations in the Middle East were basically drawn by colonials, by the results of imperialism, as geography was divided up on maps, people not necessarily thought about so much. And Iraq is a fascinating country. It entails Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, as well as Kurds in the north. So you have, different ethnicities, different religions, all kind of in this one nation that's drawn. Its lines and boundaries are basically drawn by European powers. And at the tip end of this vast country that covers a good chunk of Mesopotamia, old Mesopotamia, there is this little country, very oil rich, very wealthy indeed, called Kuwait. Well, again, August the 2nd, 1990, Iraqi troops invade. These are troops who have been ordered to invade by their leader, Saddam Hussein, who is a ruthless Ba'athist. And by ruthless, I mean ruthless. There's nothing else to say about that. Had no qualms about killing his own people, killing his friends, killing family. It just didn't matter. He was happy to do it. But this move, largely because of money, the need for money coming out of this Iran-Iraq war, this move will lead to a sort of world renunciation. I think it's something that Saddam Hussein hadn't expected, that the whole world would get really ticked off over this invasion. The United Nations becomes involved, and particularly the United States begins to operate through the United Nations to try and build, and this is, I think, one thing that speaks volumes for George H.W. Bush, but to try and build a sort of body of alliances for the purposes specifically of pushing the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And that'll partly be done through the United Nations. The multinational coalition that's ultimately constructed will include about 5 nations from the Persian Gulf itself, including, Saudi Arabia, including other nations you might not think of as wishing to participate. It was a multinational coalition. Now, don't get me wrong, the bulk of the troops would be U.S., United States troops. Large numbers of troops. The first efforts to deal with the problem are less about ridding Kuwait of Iraqi troops than about protecting Saudi Arabia. You can't talk about the first Iraq war without talking about oil. I mean, that's just part of the equation. And at the time, a lot of the argument was this is a war about oil. Maybe it was about more than that, but certainly oil was a factor. So we began to see, immediately after the invasion of Kuwait, we began to see U.S. troops being moved rapidly into positions in Saudi Arabia. All right, now this is known as Operation Desert Shield. And it's actually going to take months to get troops and materiel in place for the invasion that ultimately will occur. That comes January 16th, 1991. And during these months of preparation, I can very definitely recall the debate that was going on in this country about the U.S. really engaging in what could become the first major war since Vietnam, the first major military undertaking since Vietnam. And remember, the U.S. had left Vietnam in 73. And we were finally out completely by 75. So it had been a while. And nobody knew how this was going to go. And then on January the 16th, 1991, the U.S. initiated bombing. And I remember distinctly, I remember distinctly, because at the time it was absolutely amazing. There were CNN correspondents in Baghdad, Iraq. And they were watching the bombing from high up in a hotel. And there were cameras using night vision actually filming the bombing as U.S. planes and U.S. bombers and coalition planes and bombers flew over. There was the sky, lit up with flak and anti-aircraft fire and missiles going up and all this other stuff. That's something I don't think Americans had ever seen before. At any rate, it's something that I remember distinctly. It was a product in no small part of the technologies that had been developed during the Reagan administration, not least of which were the stealth fighter and stealth bomber, which has become far more common. We see it now, but at the time, no one had really known outside the military and a few politicians that it existed. Anyway, they managed very rapidly to begin knocking out the infrastructure of the Iraqi military and political establishment, making communications almost impossible. Saddam Hussein responds by using so-called Scud missiles and firing them against Israel and against targets in Saudi Arabia. The United States moves into place what are called Patriot missiles. These are missiles developed with guidance system to shoot down other missiles. The Scud is not particularly accurate. It has a limited range, but it does carry a warhead. And there were extraordinary fears that Saddam Hussein had armed these Scud missiles with weapons of mass destruction, specifically gas or chemical weapons, perhaps biological. The reason that was feared was because the use of chemical weapons by Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s had been a rather common occurrence. Vast waves of Iranian soldiers would charge and would be wiped out by the use of gas. At any rate, to try and wrap this up, with all these unknowns, February 23rd, some 200,000 U.S. troops moved across the Kuwaiti border and the Iraqi border from Saudi Arabia. Moving rapidly across the desert, U.S. forces, mostly armored and mechanized, surrounded the Iraqi forces in Kuwait, who had been heavily demoralized by U.S. bombing using B-52s, those large bombers that carry massive loads. 148 U.S. dead, some 35 of those killed by what we called at the time friendly fire, by accident. The U.S. had used its new technology in terms of tanks, its new capacity with nighttime bombing, night sight, guided missiles, and was able really rather handily to take out older Iraqi tanks and armament. We don't know the actual number of killed and wounded that the Iraqis experienced. One of the last episodes was along a highway connecting Baghdad and Kuwait City, in which fleeing, retreating Iraqi soldiers, many of whom had been engaged, or so the news reports recorded, engaged in looting the wealth of Kuwait, were caught on this road in massive convoys and completely obliterated by U.S. forces in extraordinarily gruesome pictures. There were critics who asked George H.W. Bush, why did you not simply pursue Iraqi forces into the heart of Iraq? Why did you not depose Saddam Hussein? All we know, I suppose, is that the coalition had been built on the idea that the purpose of the united action was removal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. I'll let you decide whether George H.W. Bush made a good decision or a bad decision to stop the invasion when he did and declare victory. But it's important to note that in 1991, U.S. troops do not penetrate into Baghdad, and Saddam Hussein remains in power. In the weeks and months following the surrender, the removal of Iraqi troops, uprisings began, spurred in no small part by rhetoric of the Bush administration, both among the Shia of southern Iraq and the Kurds of northern Iraq. And while Iraqi military was not allowed to fly actual planes, they could fly low-flying helicopters, and they could continue to use weapons that they possessed. One of the reasons George H.W. Bush received such criticism for not pursuing the Iraqis and pursuing Saddam Hussein in particular in 1991, one of the reasons the criticism was so stiff was because of the images that came back of mass executions and killings of Shia in the south of Iraq, and the use of gas against Kurds in the north. It was an amazing American victory, coalition victory, suggesting a sort of new world of cooperation, because even the Soviet Union had gone along, had coalesced in this whole movement. But there was also that tinge of incompleteness about the first Iraq War. And in fact, that war compelled further change. The Soviet Union had allowed free elections for the first time in 1989, and Gorbachev actually became the first and really only president of the Soviet Union in 1990. He had gone along with the coalition building and the United Nations sanctions and even the war itself. He had not stood in the way of the United States against a potential ally. But in August of 1991, on the heels of this war, even as the U.S. celebrated, Gorbachev experienced a coup as members of his own government and the military and the KGB, the secret police of the Soviet Union, basically had him arrested and sought to take over the government. And here was the last act, in a way. Because throughout the Soviet states, many of whom had been talking about breaking away, who had never wanted to be part of the Soviet Union, and with the old nationalisms reappearing, they gathered by the hundreds and by the thousands to protest the coup, to protest the Soviet Union. And it's just another one of those moments. It's an amazing time. Another one of those moments when you can recall the tanks coming in and wondering, is this it? It's kind of like Tiananmen Square in China. The tanks are coming. Are they going to turn their guns to protect the protesters, or are they going to fire on the protesters? One of the leaders in these 1991 events became the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. And essentially, what happened was that the Soviet military kind of divided. And though Gorbachev wouldn't retain power, and though the Soviet Union would come to an end, the reforms that he had started, and perhaps had gone further than he expected, had led to a point where the Soviet people themselves were no longer willing really to live under a Soviet system. There would be years and years of hardship. But by 1991, with the events of Iraq, with the events of the late 1980s and the fall of the Berlin Wall, by 1991, there was no longer a Soviet Union, and thus no longer sort of a clear enemy for the United States in this Cold War. What we had moved into was a sort of world of asymmetry, in which, as often as not, there would be no clear opponent for the United States or for its military. A world, it seemed, in which we would operate within coalitions. And by means of those coalitions and the UN, we would police the world. Of course, we know that that's not as easily done as said. Those of us in the 21st century.